So I love this quote by Frederick Douglass that once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. But it speaks a lot to this issue that reading, we have so many children in our country who aren't reading, and that his idea of freedom that's possible when you can read because you can access information, you can take what you're learning and better your station in life, you can find a job that is fulfilling perhaps for you and provides for your family, that economic opportunity is linked to reading, and so is personal growth and development as a human being. So I know I'm not the expert to speak about Frederick Douglass and all that that quote means. I'm sure Leslie could speak to that more fully, but I love this quote and I keep coming back to it. And I wanted us to just start from that place because each of you is here because you believe that children should be able to learn how to read, and you want to be able to help them to learn how to read so that they can have the life that they were intended to have, and that reading isn't something that keeps them from being able to open doors to opportunities down the road. And I find that really motivating for me when I'm feeling like I'm working on a Saturday. So we're going to start with that bright, sunshiny quote from Frederick Douglass. And I also want to, because we've been talking about dyslexic kiddos, and it seems like dyslexia is so sad. Children have dyslexia. And I wanted you to see this quote that more than 50% of NASA employees are dyslexic. They're deliberately sought after because they have superb problem-solving skills. Their excellent 3D and spatial awareness skills make them invaluable for some place like NASA, where people need to be able to think outside the box. They need to be able to look at the big picture. They need to be able to synthesize information from a variety of sources. And they literally can see things in the world in a different way than we do. 50% of NASA employees are dyslexic. But that doesn't mean that we can't help dyslexic children to also become readers, because we know if a reading problem is identified early and the proper intervention is applied, which is a structured literacy approach like brain-friendly reading, that 90 to 95% of children who are at risk, which means kiddos who likely would be struggling without this kind of approach, become fluent readers. 95% of children. And guess what? The good news is we now know what those key characteristics are, and we can screen for them as early as kindergarten to say who is at risk for a reading struggle, and then give them intense intervention so that they don't ever have to struggle. And they can have the brain, all the benefits of being a dyslexic child, and have the advantages of being able to read. So what if dyslexic children were able to read fluently and had all the advantages of a dyslexic brain? That would be like having a superpower, wouldn't it? And that dyslexia doesn't have to be a life struggle. And in schools, we provide accommodations for those kiddos. And we say, well, they can have extra time on test and they don't have to read as much of the book, and we'll reduce their workload. How about if we just taught them how to read? Because remediation is possible. So the appropriate accommodation for a dyslexic child is just to teach them how to read. That's a new way of thinking about it. I just wanted you to see this graphic here about what the brain looks like, because we're talking about building those neurological pathways in the brain. And here are a couple of different scans of brains. And you can see the difference between the literate brain and the newly literate brain is really on fire, and what an illiterate brain is. And then at the bottom, you can see what it looks like before and after intervention, that clearly after 10 weeks of intervention, that there is more neurological activity happening in the brain. Dyslexia is a brain-based learning difference. It's brain-based. So a lot of places around the country will try to sell you vision screenings and vision therapy as a way to cure dyslexia. And while there's some question around whether there's vision issues that are comorbid, which means they go with dyslexia or not, that dyslexia is not a vision issue specifically. It's a neurobiological issue. It doesn't mean a child might not have a vision issue, but dyslexia itself is not that. And we know that dyslexia is genetic, that it runs in families, and that we know it can be something that even parents aren't aware of, that maybe they just thought they didn't really like to read and they didn't understand that there was something else going on for them. And then they see it in their children and think, well, Johnny just doesn't like to read either. And dyslexia is not a preference issue or a behavior issue or a try harder or a do more issue. That it's genetic and it's a different learning difference that is one that is in the brain, that it's a brain-based learning difference, and that it's also common. So 1 in 5 children have characteristics of dyslexia. And remember that dyslexia is on a spectrum, that children can be severely dyslexic, moderately, mildly dyslexic. They might have some characteristics, mild characteristics of dyslexia that show up. Maybe they had really good reading instruction when they were younger, and when they're older, their reading is fine, but their spelling is not so good. So those characteristics of dyslexic children can show up in different ways. And that line between are you dyslexic or are you not is something that's evaluated by a professional who has letters after their name, not by people like us. We aren't doing that diagnosing. It's a medical diagnosis.
In your binder that you're creating for yourself, you might have printed off a document titled The Observable Characteristics of Children with Dyslexia. And if you watch the video, you might have seen me reference this document, or you might have seen a picture of it. And the reason this is very helpful for you to have and to read through is because if you're working with children who are reading, as Julie said, 1 in 5 children are dyslexic. Now that's 20%. That's the high end. Some people think it might be as low as 10, but either way, there's a lot of children who are definitely dyslexic. And then there are children who have characteristics of children who are dyslexic. And they all benefit from this structured literacy approach. So if you haven't printed off this observable characteristics, it is one document that I would suggest that you have at your ready disposal. And the reason why is because when you go to meet with a parent, whether it's in school or whether it is in a tutoring session, one of the things that they'll ask you, since there's more awareness about dyslexia, is my child dyslexic? And if you watch the video, you know, unless you are a person who's qualified to do a neuropsych eval, you cannot diagnose children with dyslexia. But you can say, I have some information about that, and you can hand them a document, or you can point them to, if you have a teacher website, you might have it even up on your website if you're allowed to do that. And point the parents toward those characteristics, because the parents recognize the characteristics. And then they begin to think, maybe this is something I need to look into. And that's the best thing that you can do for them.
This is something for you to really be aware of, because when you're in your classrooms working, that very bottom group of children that are in the red zone on the ladder of reading who are dyslexic, they often will need more intense intervention than what you're going to be able to provide in the classroom. So that what I'm teaching you to do is going to really help those children in the orange zone who aren't dyslexic necessarily, but need really direct and explicit instruction that's cumulative, that's phonics based. But those kids who are at the red zone, especially at the bottom of the red zone, they're the ones who will become really obvious that those children need more intense intervention, which just means they need more intervention, more repetitions, and they need it more frequently. That's what really differentiates dyslexic children in the red zone from those in the orange zone. I mean, there's a lot of biological reasons that they're different, but in terms of the remediation, that those children with dyslexia need it more. They need more of what it is we're doing. So, and that's often not possible in a classroom setting to provide that level of intervention. But it does help to differentiate those children really clearly when you start to move everybody else up the ladder of reading and those children are creeping up the ladder of reading. So I hope that you begin to observe in your classrooms when you are able to get back into classrooms and have groups of children together, that you're able to see those differences between those groups of kiddos and have a sense of who might be someone that really does need that more intense level, instead of like some of you are in classrooms where only a few children are reading on grade level and it looks like everybody needs intense instruction. Well, I'm going to teach you how to use this program for whole group instruction. And as you do that, the children who aren't really dyslexic, who don't have a neurobiological deficit, those children are going to move along more quickly. So the group will start to differentiate itself, and you'll be able to see more clearly who those children are that really do need more intense instruction.
Dyslexia, it's a key piece. We're not solely focused on working with children who are dyslexic, because the good news is that what works for dyslexics works for all children. The way we need to teach dyslexics, the way they have to be taught in order to learn to read, are actually best practices for all children. So when we teach according to the needs of dyslexic children and we understand what works for them, we also understand how other children are benefited. The difference is that in the way the instruction is delivered.
I'm just looking here really quickly, and I saw somebody say that the math struggle was new. So dyslexia is one piece. Dyscalculia is the math component to it, and not all children who are dyslexic have dyscalculia, for sure. But some children do, and it's, again, on a spectrum about how much their math is impacted. Here is one way that is really easy to see that children who struggle with reading might also struggle with memorizing math facts. So both of my kiddos are exceptional math students. My 6th grader is taking algebra. My child who's in college got a math award for her AP calculus. Like, they're exceptional math students. I'm a decent math student, but they're exceptional math students. Guess who doesn't know their math facts? It took my daughter until she was in college to learn her math facts. So really know them. And my son, who's doing algebra, he'll still go 6 times 8, 48. And it takes him a minute. He doesn't have automaticity with it. And he's not really willing to work on it either. So that motivation piece is definitely a part of it. And they can also have issues with their handwriting. So that's called dysgraphia. And we're going to do a whole section on dysgraphia, because that's much more common, something that you'll have to address. If you're tutoring, you'll run across children who have dyscalculia, and then you'll want to dig into how to work with that. Eventually, we'll be creating training programs around that too, but that's not our focus now. One of the things I loved about the group I was just watching is that the women who were on there were sharing about the things that were difficult for them, the things that they still stumble over. And a couple of the women were sharing with each other about how there's some pieces that are hard for them, and that's okay. It's okay to say things that are wrong. It's okay to do it incorrectly and then come back and correct yourself. Because I don't know who it was, because I wasn't watching who was speaking, but one of the women was sharing about how in her classroom she'll make a mistake when she's tapping the chart or doing something, and then she goes back and corrects herself and is like, oh, wait. And that's modeling for the children that it's A-okay to make mistakes, and B, that you can go back and correct yourself, and that's just fine. So I always say I make mistakes on purpose to just make sure that everybody feels comfortable. And that I model how to make mistakes and recover for my children all the time. Isn't that beautiful?